It's the day after Passover, and Star and Mark are preparing themselves to tell their daughter the story of what happened to Jesus after Passover.
So, Daddy, will you finally tell me how this holiday has anything to do with Jesus?
We will, honey. But before we tell you, there's something you gotta know first. You know how we always call Jesus the Christ or Messiah?
Yes!
Do you know what that means?
No.
Well, Messiah is Hebrew for the promised Savior, the King God had promised his people for thousands of years. That's who Jesus was.
Wow!
Yeah, God first told his servant Abraham, the forefather, about this king, and how one day he would rise up to save his people. God also told many of his prophets about him too. He gave them all sorts of prophecies, hinting at where he would come from, his greatness, and what he would do. One thing that was certain about him was that he would suffer.
Wait, suffer? What does that mean? What happened to Jesus?
Don't worry, sweetie, we'll tell you, but first we need to pick where we left off.
Remember how we told you that Jesus also celebrated the Passover?
Yeah?
Well, he celebrated it with his 12 disciples, and in the middle of the feast, Jesus told them that one of them would betray him.
Betrayed? What do you mean? Who would betray Jesus?
Well, a little before the feast, Judas Iscariot, one of the disciples, made a deal with the Pharisees, the religious leaders who hated Jesus. They promised to give Judas 30 pieces of silver if they would tell them where Jesus was, for they wanted to arrest him and question him.
And at the feast, after Jesus said that there was a traitor, Jesus told Judas to do what he was going to do quickly. So Judas left to get the soldiers to arrest Jesus.
One of Jesus' friends gave him up for money?
Yes. You see, at that moment, the devil entered Judas, convincing him to take up the Pharisees' offer and betray Jesus.
Back to the story. A little after Judas left, Jesus took the other disciples out with him to the Mountain of Olives to pray. The disciples fell asleep, but Jesus stayed awake and continued to pray. You see, he was so worried about what was going to happen to him. He prayed to God and asked him if the bad things that were going to happen to him would be taken away and not happen. But still, he remembered that he wanted God's will to be done, and not his own.
What bad things?
We're getting to that. A little while later, the soldiers from the temple came to where Jesus was, and Judas was leading them. When they came, some of the disciples ran away, but Peter tried to fight them off and stop them. He even cut off one of their ears. But Jesus told him to stop. He also reattached the man's ear. He told him not to worry, for all this needed to happen. So Peter ran away, and Jesus was arrested and taken to the high priest Caiaphas.
There, Jesus was judged before him and the other priests. They made so many accusations against him, but Jesus stayed quiet and said nothing. And after a while, Caiaphas finally asked what he really wanted to know.
Eshalak, Yeshua Nazaret. Amar lana en ant Meshiach bar elachachai.
ברנש יתר בימים חיים, יתר בענני שמים.
שילה!
Blasphemy?
That means to take something that is holy and say something bad or wrong about it. In this case, the Pharisees were saying that Jesus was doing bad by lying about being God's son.
But he is God's son.
He is, but the Pharisees didn't believe that. They thought Jesus was just an ordinary man saying it. And back then, that was no little thing. In those days of ancient Israel, if someone was caught lying about something like that, it was bad enough to sentence you to death. Which unfortunately Jesus was.
Oh no, Jesus!
The next day, the Pharisees went to see the Romans.
Huh? Why did they need to see them?
Well, remember how we told you Rome was in control of Israel at that time?
Yeah?
Well, the law stated only the Romans were allowed to sentence someone to death. So they went to the Roman governor of Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate, to have him execute Jesus for them. When they went to Pilate, they made the same accusations about Jesus, saying that he was tricking the people, telling them to refuse the law and not to pay taxes to the emperor. Then Pilate talked privately to Jesus. Then after, Pilate went back out to the crowd and said he found nothing wrong in Jesus, but they still demanded Jesus be put to death. They told Pilate that he entices vice wherever he goes, from Galilee to Jerusalem. When Pilate learned Jesus was from Galilee, he decided to send him to King Herod because Galilee was under his jurisdiction.
Herod? But I thought you said he died when Jesus was small.
No. That was Herod the Great. He's the one who died. The guy Jesus was taken to was Herod Antipas, Herod the Great's son. A side note here, this was the same King Herod who had John the Baptist killed.
Oh, gosh.
When Herod saw Jesus, he was excited. He heard all about the miracles and wonders he did all over, and wanted to see a little bit of that for himself. He and his guards mocked and ridiculed Jesus as they asked him questions and others accused him. But just like before, Jesus said nothing. So after a whole lot of quiet from Jesus, Herod gave Jesus a really nice robe and sent him back to Pilate.
When Jesus was brought back to Pilate, Pilate had to think of a way to settle the matter quickly.
How?
Well, you see, every year during the Passover, Rome would take one prisoner they had and set him free. This time around, they had a murderer who was part of a rebellion, Barabbas. So Pilate decided to let the people decide for themselves who should go free, Jesus or Barabbas.
And who did they choose?
Eșal conținut! M-am mințena și si vilcom! Și si Baraba!
Liberate-o!
They chose Barabbas over Jesus? But he was a murderer.
Sadly, yeah. The Pharisees convinced the crowd to vote for Barabbas instead of Jesus, made them think Jesus was worse than him. So the people wanted to put him to death. But Pilate knew deep down that Jesus did nothing wrong, so he decided to just have Jesus flogged, then released.
Flagged?
Flogged, sweetie. That means they had to beat Jesus. A lot.
Oh no. How did they do it?
They did it by hitting him with a lot of these leather whips that had shards of bone and metal on the tips. Each lash covered marks in Jesus' flesh, which made stripes on his skin.
How badly was Jesus hurt?
Well, the gospel itself doesn't specify how badly, just that he was flogged. But we do get a pretty good idea of how badly in Isaiah 52.
What does it say?
Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness.
So, you mean?
Yes, Jesus was hit so many times with those whips, he didn't even look like a person anymore. And if that wasn't horrible enough, afterwards some soldiers did some more bad things to him. They made this crown out of some thorns and jammed it onto Jesus' head. Then they put a purple robe on him and hailed Jesus as a king, only to make fun of him. And they kept doing that as they kept hitting him with these sticks and spitting on him.
After that happened, Pilate showed Jesus to the people, hoping they would be satisfied, but the crowd wasn't. They insisted Jesus be put to death. The Pharisees kept telling Pilate that Jesus was calling himself a king greater than the emperor, which was against the law, and told Pilate if he didn't kill him, Pilate would be no friend of Caesar's. Pilate was worried. He told Jesus, "Why don't you say anything? Don't you realize I have the power to put you to death or otherwise set you free?"
But Jesus answered, "You have no power over me, except what was given to you from above. That is why the one who sent me to you is guilty of the greater sin."
Pilate understood, so he got some water and washed his hands in front of everyone and said, I'm innocent of this man's blood. It's your responsibility. Then he sent Jesus to be executed.
Oh no! What did they have him die of?
Jesus had to die in the most painful way possible. Crucifixion.
What's that?
You know how we as Christians use a cross to symbolize our faith, and it's very important?
Yeah?
Well, the reason for that is because that cross is what Jesus died on.
What? How could he die on something like that?
Jesus had to be carried to a certain place to be killed first, and he had to carry a huge version of that cross along with him. It was about 3 to 4 meters high and weighed about 165 pounds, and Jesus had to carry it by himself after being viciously beaten and scorned. He had to carry that incredibly heavy cross by himself for over 2,000 feet.
He had to carry it that far?
Not all the way. You see, a little later, Jesus couldn't carry it all the way by himself, so the soldiers picked a random man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene, and ordered him to help Jesus. And he did. He helped carry that cross with Jesus all the way to Golgotha.
What?
In Hebrew, Golgotha means skull. It's where executions were supposed to be held.
When Jesus got there, 2 other prisoners, thieves, were supposed to be executed along with him. Jesus was offered a cup of wine mixed with myrrh, a spice to help dull the pain, because dying by crucifixion was especially painful. But Jesus refused it. He was willing to take every bit of pain that came along with it.
What kind of pain? What did they do to him?
First, they stripped him naked. Then they laid him down on the cross and had him spread both his arms out to each end of it. Then they took these nails, these 5 to 7 inch long nails, and drove them through both of his wrists. And when they did that to each arm, they had to dislocate his shoulders and stretch his arm out as wide as they could to the very edge of the cross. That's 3 feet on each side.
Then they had to start on his feet. They put one leg in front of the other and drove a nail through both of Jesus' feet. Finally, to top it all off, they put the cross upright so Jesus would hang by the nails that were driven through him.
Oh, Jesus.
Yes, it was very painful. In fact, it was so bad in his body, Jesus had to push on the nails and hop up and down on that cross just to breathe.
He hung there for hours. Above him on the cross hung a sign that Pilate wrote. It was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And below him, a bunch of things went on. There were Roman soldiers bedding over his clothes, there were people mocking and making fun of him, and there were also the priests mocking him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself. Let us see him get down from that cross, and then we'd believe him."
And did he?
No. He physically could, but he just didn't.
And after all that, all the pain they did to him, all the things they said, do you know what Jesus said about the people who did that to him?
He told them that they were all going to get punished for what they did?
No, he turned to heaven and said to God, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing." Even after all they did to him, he still wanted God to forgive them.
Whoa.
Later, one of the thieves that was crucified with Jesus mocked him too, saying, "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us too." Immediately after, the other criminal who was crucified rebuked him, saying, "Don't you fear God? We received the same sentence he did, but he has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus and said, "Remember me, Jesus, when you become as king." Then Jesus answered the man, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And throughout that time, 3 women close to Jesus witnessed these things happen to him. Mary, the wife of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, and Jesus' own mother, Mary.
Jesus' mom saw all that happened to him?
Yeah, as a mother, I can only imagine what was going through her mind. Not just how horrible it was to witness her own son getting hurt so bad, but to also accept that all this had to happen to him.
Yeah. And when Jesus saw his mom, he said to her and his disciple John, "Mother, take John as your son, and John, take my mother as your mother." And at that moment, John took Mary back to his home.
Later in the 9th hour, Jesus shouted, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." Then the people said, "Look, he's calling Elijah. Let's see if Elijah will save him."
What?
Oh, when Jesus shouted Eli, the people thought he was calling out to the prophet Elijah. But actually, Eli translated to God in his own language. So actually, Jesus was saying, my God, why have you abandoned me?"
But why would Jesus say that? God would never leave him. He's his dad.
Honey, it's time you know why Jesus was really up there.
Do you know why we call Jesus the Lamb?
No. Why?
Because a long time ago, when people needed to pay for their sins, they had to give a spotless lamb to their priests and have it sacrificed to God in order for its blood to cover your sin. The thing is, that was only enough to cover one person's one sin, so they had to constantly do this. That's why God gave us Jesus. He was meant to be that lamb to cover people's sin, but not just one person's one sin. You see, Jesus was so holy, so righteous, that his blood was enough to cover every person's every sin. So now all we need to do is accept Jesus as our Lord, and we will be saved. But in order for him to be sacrificed, he had to die that way on the cross. So brutally, so painfully. For you see, everyone deserved that to happen, what happened to Jesus. But Jesus was willing to take everyone's punishment for himself, so we wouldn't have to.
Everyone's? Every sin?
Think about it like this. Every one sin you do deserves a whip. But instead of you taking it, Jesus took it. Anyways, back to the story. The reason why Jesus shouted it is because at that moment, all of the world's sin was on him. He could only sense God's judgment.
Then, close to noonday, a dark storm appeared before them. Then Jesus said, "I'm thirsty." So the Romans took a sponge, soaked it with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to Jesus. But Jesus didn't take it.
Sour wine?
It's basically just vinegar.
Oh, yeah.
Finally, at the last hour, Jesus cried out to God again, saying, "Father, into your hands I give you my spirit." Then, with his final words, Jesus said, "It is finished," then died.
At that very second, the whole earth began to shake, and at the same time, the curtain in the room of the Holy Temple of Jerusalem was miraculously torn in two. Again, we'll discuss that later. When the guards around Jesus saw what happened, they were astonished and realized surely he was the Son of God. Later as night came, a rich man and believer in Jesus named Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate and asked to take Jesus' body. Pilate allowed this and gave him the body.
So Joseph took Jesus' body, wrapped it in clean linen cloth that he had just bought, and placed Jesus in the tomb he originally bought for himself. Then, with Mary Magdalene and Jesus' mother watching on the other side, they sealed up the tomb with a large stone and laid him to rest.
Luna, baby, what's wrong?
I like Jesus. He was so nice. They killed him.
Aw, honey. Luna, Jesus is perfectly fine.
Yeah, Jesus is okay.
But
I know the whole story of his pain, but think about it. What was Jesus made of?
Man,
And
God,
Exactly. So knowing that, do you really think a few whips, nails, and a big old wooden cross was enough to put him down for the count?
I still don't get it. You said Jesus was killed by all that. You just said he died.
Don't worry, honey. This'll make way more sense on Easter.
There in the ground his body lay, light of the world by darkness slain. Then bursting forth in glorious day, up from the grave he rose again.